It's a nightmare scenario as mass defaults are coming that threaten to break the banks. I'm your host, Steve Van Metre, and thanks for joining me today. And as Americans are already struggling from the effects of high inflation, it's about to get much worse as a new line item is going to hit the budgets of tens of millions of Americans and it's going to threaten to send them into default and take the banks down with them. Let's head over to Bloomberg, where we picked today's story up that strained budgets could buckle when student loan debt repayments resume. Many Americans are dreading the return of student loan bills as they grapple with surging rent, gas prices, and other costs. And federal student debt payments were first frozen in March of 2020 as part of a broad stimulus effort meant to protect Americans from the worst of the pandemic economic slump. Even as the economy quickly recovered, leading to the strongest labor market in decades, the freeze was extended multiple times. And now in the latest forbearance period is set to end August 31st as prices surge for gas, groceries, and rent, and fears grow that a recession is around the corner. And this is one good way we'll get a recession, because what is a recession? It's a downturn in demand. It's when the economy slows down because people cannot afford to continue to consume at the prior rate. And what is one of the biggest reasons people can't? Well, their wages don't keep up with inflation and their debt levels. And now many millions of Americans are going to get saddled with a brand new payment that they haven't been having to deal with for a couple of years. People just don't have enough money, says Thomas Goki, co-founder of the Debt Collective and advocacy group for those facing debt. If they restart payments, whether it's in August, whether it's after the midterms, there will be mass defaults because people simply cannot pay. And for Mary Gorman in Long Island, New York, paying student loan bills, who is just one of many stories alongside rent and groceries, is going to be a challenge. The 26-year-old just graduated from law school and starts a job as a public defender in New York City this September. That's also when she'll have to start paying back some $145,000 in federal student debt, or roughly $500 a month on a salary of about $70,000 a year. And I didn't realize so much of my salary would be going to loans that I needed for my education, she said. I'm going to end up eating a lot of ramen and not being able to do anything for fun. But that is exactly the point of what happened with all of this debt. And you think about what drives the economy. It's not people just paying rent. It's not people making their car payment or buying groceries. It's the discretionary side, the excess money people have to either invest or go on vacation or to go out to dinner. And that is all going to slow down for tens of millions of people because they can't even afford the new debt that is coming back, the debt they've already had. Those new payments are coming back in a big way, and that is going to throttle spending at a time when what do we hear from Target and Walmart and other retailers? Too much inventory. Well, if people have less money to spend, what's going to happen to that inventory? It's going to have to get discounted more and more and more. And what you're seeing here in this news here is disinflationary, perhaps even deflationary. Let's continue on because it's a rough start. While student loans affect people of all ages, younger millennials and Generation Z are being hit particularly hard, especially since they typically have much lower earnings. And the cost of school is much more expensive, but the wages people are getting after they get a degree are not what they used to be. I don't have any money left over at the end of the day to pay those student loans back because the expenses of everything else just keeps going up, meaning they're likely to default. And a recent survey, get this, shows 89% of borrowers are not ready to pay the student loans come due in September. And with recent inflation costs tightening people's wallets, the question many people are asking themselves is how? How am I going to make those payments when everything around us is going up? The countdown for borrowers begins, and they now have less than 60 days to figure out what they're going to do. According to the survey by the Student Debt Crisis Center, 89% of borrowers say they're not ready as fall nears. And that means 89% of people could be facing immediate delinquencies if they start missing payments and then are put into default a short period later. And how bad is it going to get? Well, a lot worse than you think. Student loan repayments restart in 8 weeks. Is another extension coming? Well, Biden might cancel some student loan debt and allow payments to resume in September to balance out the impact on inflation, according to Business Insider on Wednesday. However, Secretary of Education told Senate subcommittee in June that another moratorium extension remains a possibility. And I don't have any information now to share with you about when it would end or what the conversations are about when it's going to be lifted, Cardona said. I know we have a date, and it could be that it's extended, or it could be that it starts there. but I will say that our borrowers will have ample notice. Well, right now, they've got less than 60 days. Is that really ample notice? I'm not so sure. The student loan freeze halts payments and interest for 35 million Americans and suspends collection efforts against the 7 million borrowers currently in default. So if you just do some rough math, 89% of 35 million is somewhere shy of 30 million people that, according to that recent survey, said they cannot afford these payments. Now you think, how much does about 30 million people affect the economy? In a huge way. If they're not out spending money, if all their money is going to rent and energy, gas, groceries, and debt payments, that leaves nothing else, and that's going to have a major impact on the economy. Now, the good news is those 7 million people in default, from what I've read, they get a fresh start. They get pulled out of default, and they get another go at it. But we'll assume, since they're in default now, and the situation for the economy with inflation has gotten worse, well, it won't be long before they're back. Collectively, that's allowed taxpayers to defer repaying nearly $200 billion, according to an analysis from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Now, if you're concerned at all what a massive amount of defaults in the student loan space could mean for the economy as people are not spending, the question you should be wondering is are we indeed heading into a deflationary recession? Our chief strategist, Jeff Snyder, tells us that is a high probability coming this year. And the question you should really be asking is, can your portfolio recover from the losses that it's taken this year? Is the strategy going to work? Well, there's one that has the potential. That's Portfolio Shield. I'll put a link up here in the corner and description below, because when you understand how it hedges with bonds and you understand that bond prices rise during periods of disinflation or deflation, well, you can see how it, against its peers, can recover its losses. Because things in the labor market, well, they looked good, but are they really that good? Let's head over to Wall Street Journal, where we continue today's story. As jobs report could keep the Fed on track for a 75 basis point rise in July, as Fed officials said they expect the unemployment rate to rise slightly amid interest rate increases. So they expect you to lose your job. Now think about that. They're telling people, look, we know you're going to lose your job. And on top of that, they're going to have all of these student loan payments on in addition. And you think about what policymakers have decisions they've made. And I'm not going to pick on any specific one, but just generally, what did we do? We gave people fiscal and monetary stimulus to get through the pandemic. And in this case, we said, don't make your loan payments, when perhaps we should have actually just let them do that, because we gave people money to make those payments, but we didn't. And then we got rampant inflation, and that's bad news too. In fact, it may be worse, all of this inflation over time, than anything else. And policymakers can't stop, because now what do we need? Inflation relief, right? We need to help people because it's really bad, and it is. But what is that going to lead to? Probably more inflation until something in the system breaks. And that could be the employment market. As employers added 372,000 jobs in June, you're saying, wow, that's great news. But maybe it doesn't matter as much as you think. According to the Labor Department on Friday, the unemployment rate held steady at 3.6% for the fourth month in a row. Now remember, it's that 3.6 that the Fed says they don't care if it goes up. Average hourly wages rose 0.3% from May, a step down from higher levels earlier this year that, if sustained, could make Fed officials slightly less anxious about overheating the labor market. But while that is good, and it's good to see people getting raises, is it enough? Well, the answer is not even close, because look at the average hourly earnings came in year over year at 5.1%. Well, do you know where inflation is? It's over 8. And look at this, weekly hours unchanged. So it's not like people are getting more hours in work time so they can afford higher costs. They can't. And of course, we're seeing the participation rate is starting to languish as people are not coming back into the workforce. What's going on here is and when you look at the situation, we take average hourly earnings of all employees, and we subtract the consumer price index to see where wages are keeping up with inflation. And I didn't pull this chart all the way back to the inception, but generally what you see is wages keep up with inflation. You can see it's kind of bopping around here a little bit, but overall it keeps up with inflation. That's what you want. But notice now, since the pandemic ended, here we see back roughly around March of 2020, that wages have not kept up with inflation. And they kind of got close to catching up, but they were already coming back up from a negative number, and now they're headed down. It's very obvious why people can't afford their student loan payments. It's not that they don't want to, they don't have the money to. And what that should lead to, but we're not seeing, is people coming back into the workforce, and we get that from the participation rate. Now, the participation rate is those who are actively working. So if you are working right now, that actually counts. You're counted in the labor force. If you are looking for a job, you're also counted in this statistic. Now, if you're not looking, but you're able to work, well, then you're not counted at all. And the idea is that if wages go up enough people who are at home that aren't working might re-enter the search for a job, re-enter the labor market, and we should see the participation rate rising a lot. But for some reason, we're not. And here you can see it in blue. It's kind of rolling over. And that is not a very good sign. Now, I've overlaid the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, the monetary base, and I've inverted it. You see a little negative sign there. And you've noticed these have a pretty good relationship. The question I've been wondering is, will the Fed unwind its balance sheet fast enough to help push the labor market up by tightening financial conditions, or will the participation rate come crashing down as we head into a recession? Maybe we get a perfect storm, and they both happen. Now, something snaps in the labor market is full of part-time workers plunge as multiple job holders soar. This from Zero Hedge. Now, if true, a problem emerges when looking at the more detailed of less closely watched household survey. Here, unlike the establishment survey, the June's job change was actually striking a 315,000 drop after the April plunge of 353,000. The June drop was actually the biggest going back to the March 2020 crash. Now, if you want to know what Jeff Snyder, our chief strategist, thinks about this jobs report, well, you've got to sign up for Markets Insider Pro. There is a link in the description below. Just go down there, show more. You'll see the description. It's the only way you can get it. On Monday, we're going to put out this deep dive report on the labor market. It's free for a limited time. You don't want to miss it. Forget what everyone else says. He's a guy that knows how the system works. Let's continue on, because what's going on here, and Jeff will talk about this in his report, is starting at the top. We will find the discrepancy between the establishment survey, the headline number of 372,000 jobs created, which is great, against the household survey that said, wait a minute, 315,000 fell. Of course, Jeff covers what's going on here. But look, even more remarkable, the number of multiple job holders whose primary and secondary jobs are both full-time hit a record high, and hardly a sign of a strong job market, one where people can afford to quit jobs at will. So what's going on here? Well, the simple answer is fewer people are working, but those who are working are taking on extra jobs, and that could be due to, of course, lingering effects of the pandemic. Perhaps someone needs to stay home with the kids, so they can't go back to work. So one worker, instead of having one job, now has two, maybe even three, depending on the situation, and that does not bode well, as they said here in Zero Hedge, for a strong economy. It doesn't look good at all. But let's continue on, because this payroll report isn't a big deal. And I want to mention this because a lot of people fixate, wow, look at the jobs, we're not in recession. Well, maybe we can be in recession because jobs actually are found. People actually take jobs during recession. Why? Because they need the money. You think about it, someone who's retired, who's, pension or Social Security are not keeping up with inflation, they might go back to work. Someone else might have to take on two jobs. All these things get counted. But what's notable is when we look at the total non-farm payroll report, you can see it doesn't tend to turn negative until we are in a recession or late in a recession, and sometimes toward the end of one. So the idea that we're still putting out 372,000 jobs doesn't mean that we aren't in a recession. It just means 372,000 jobs, according to the government, was created. But what we do know is when we take the total non-farm payrolls on a year-over-year rate of change and overlay the consumer price index on a year-over-year rate of change, what we notice as consumer prices go up, we see the change in jobs head down and then eventually contract. We see this happen over and over again, and this is simply for one reason. The same thing we see in this deal with student loans. People cannot afford inflation. Their wages just don't keep up with it. As we looked at on that other chart, they just aren't keeping up. That leads to less demand. The economy slows down and then eventually contracts. People then, of course, lose their jobs. And we can see kind of maybe the leading indicator here, the 4-week average of initial claims against the consumer price index on a year-over-year rate of change. And we see as prices go up, eventually employers start to lay off. And so we can tell with a lagging effect now, if we see this big rise in consumer prices, prices. We're seeing the early stages of people starting to lose their job, and it's likely to continue to accelerate. But the Fed says, doesn't matter. We're still potentially on play for a 75 basis point hike. We'll see this coming week what the CPI comes in at. I think it comes down a little bit, but certainly not enough to bring the Fed off their tightening plans, and that will eventually be overdone and lead, of course, as our chief strategist Jeff Snyder says, to a deflationary recession, possibly later this year. I'm Steve Van Meter. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being fans. Bye now.